Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. How are y'all doing? I am grateful for everybody's attendance here today to listen to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Robert Harvey. First, before I go any further, I want to just acknowledge and thank President Rabb and Howard Holzer for their leadership. I want to also thank Peter, Bianca, Alexis, the JFU students who are here. Good to see you. Phil, Aaron, and Danny, who are also supporting us today. Again, my name is, I actually didn't do this at the start. I'm Basil Smikle, by the way, Director of the Public Policy Program, Distinguished Lecturer here for those that don't know me. And we are, this is one of several brown bags that we've had this semester. We're actually, just as by way of announcement, sort of starting a new thing where we're not just having the event in person, but we're also going to be using this as the beginnings of a podcast, if you will. So you'll be able to find after this a recording of this, an audio recording. Is that right, Danny? On thank you for the thumbs up on Spotify. Yep. So we're branching out and we're growing and we're really excited about that. So thank you for being a part of this in person. We do have another one. We actually have a very full week next week. You probably have seen a conversation with Mayor de Blasio that'll be taking place here. There's some other programming that you'll be getting invitations to as well. So we're really excited about what's happening here at Roosevelt House, and thank you all for coming and participating. And I really do, I will say this with all manner of sort of pride and humility, that when I heard first of all, I worked with Dr. Harvey as part of I guess an advisory board with the in East Harlem with East Harlem Scholar Academies. But I will tell you, when I heard this brother speak, I had to find a way to get more people to hear him. He spoke to some folks at Columbia Teachers College a couple of weeks. Actually, that was almost a month ago, which seems like a long time ago, but it went very quickly. And I'll tell you that the students there were blown away. And after you left the conversation, you were there? Oh, hey, how are you? The students were blown away, and I said, we've got to hear more from this brother. So just very quickly, and I want him to sort of fill in the gaps in the bio, but I'll just say, Dr. Harvey has a longstanding history of prioritizing a vision for equity, justice, academic success, and social emotional wellness for students. He is the Chief Academic Officer and Superintendent of East Harlem Scholars Academies. Prior to joining East Harlem, he served as head of school and CEO of Star Academy College Preparatory School in Memphis. Is that where you're from?
No, St. Louis.
St. Louis, all right. Born and raised in St. Louis. During his tenure, Dr. Harvey led Star through double-digit academic gains, increased enrollment, secured a 10-year charter renewal, and strengthened philanthropic investment. He also served as Chief Operating Officer of Simmons College of Kentucky and adjunct professor in its Department of Social Sciences, and has served independent day and boarding schools in several capacities. He's committed himself to lifelong learning and public scholarship, earned a doctorate in leadership and society from Memphis Theological Seminary, Master of Theological Studies from Harvard University, and Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Social Research from Bryant University. He's also completed executive graduate programs in organizational change and school management from Emeritus Institute and Harvard Graduate School of Education, respectively. Serves on the national boards of JUICE, the Collective, and is a member of the National Alliance of Black School Educators and the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Young Leaders. And he's here today in part because he's written this book on abolitionist leadership in schools, undoing systemic injustice through communally conscious education. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Robert Harvey. Doctor, first question that I ask of you is, I read your bio, but really tell us how you got into this work.
Yeah, thanks, Basil. And so good to be with all of you all today. So my journey into this work really begins, and I tell people very proudly, I am a grandson of the Great Migration. And so my grandparents were born and raised in Mississippi and followed the first wave of migration, that 1910 to 1940 period from Mississippi to St. Louis, where they were seeking economic opportunity. And it was there that I remember my grandmother telling me that the only higher ed option available to her after 8th grade at that moment was the St. Louis Negro Secretarial Institute. And she became a typist and a secretary for a white family on Lindo Boulevard. And that for me that story was the beginning of wrestling with the intersection of race and economics and education and how Black folks now in a postmodern world still have limited options. And so what took me into this journey was really wrestling with the fact that while the names of our institutes have changed, we are still trying to create pathways of possibility for Black folks like Alma Burns, my grandmother, who knew that education was a marker and an indicator of possibility, but that the options were slim and few in a racist kind of capitalist society.
And you work at a charter school.
Yeah.
And right. And so let's talk about that, because we don't need to necessarily get into all of the controversy and discussion now about that, but I imagine there might have been some trepidation at first.
Yeah, I mean, it still is.
Okay,
right? I mean,
okay.
I'm still petrified most days. I mean, in part because while I work at a charter school, I work in education.
Yeah.
Right? And my commitment, which is why it can start in day and boarding schools, but mostly white students in New England, go to a HBCU where 100% of everybody walking around is Black, to then go to a public charter space is really informed by, I am committed to ensuring that Black and brown kids, regardless of context, have a pathway, right? And so for me, I don't consider myself a charter person. I consider myself a family quality, high option person. That if families have access to an option, that option needs to work for all kids. And so while there's trepidation for me, many times because of the ways in which charters have been politicized, I am called to, I think, a higher calling in education, which is regardless of the space needs to be freeing and liberating for all the kids who decide to show up every day.
So let's talk about that space, because on this stage, the first brown bag that we had was on criminal justice reform, and we heard Professor Calvin Smiley talk about an abolitionist approach to reform. It's an amazing framework. Talk a little bit about that framework and how you bring it to education.
Yeah, so this is really helpful. In full transparency, my acquiring editors here from Rutledge, Dan, and my framework, I think, pushes back a bit on the carceral prison form of abolition, which is often grounded in deconstruction of a thing, right? How do we get rid of this particular carceral system? I am more interested in an abolitionist framework that's very historical, right? So when you look at chapter 2 of this text, for me, abolition grounds itself in 4 realities. One, the abolition is an individual work, that it is a communal work, that it really engages the communal reality, but it's an artistic work, right? I lift up folks like Phyllis Wheatley, and we wrestle with the fact that abolitionists in the kind of 1800 movement use art to really wrestle with the idea of radical humanity. And then ultimately for me, it is a spiritual work, lowercase s. It is a work that must resonate deeply in the soul of people, the soul of community. And so that's the way in which I situate the frame. And all of that for me yields that abolition cannot just be about the deconstruction of a model that is oppressive if we are not prepared to reimagine what that new model looks like. And so for me, abolition is as much a reimagination and a recasting of the future than it is a deconstruction of the present.
Does that mean, and we'll get into the text of the book in a second, but does that mean that you tear the system down, or can it be reimagined from its current structure?
Yeah, so I say both of those are camps. My camp is to burn the thing down.
Okay.
Like to its core.
Okay.
And I am honest enough to know that so many of our systems are so deeply entrenched in the system of today that my starting point is burning down rooms in the building. And that's the way I frame it, right? That if I burn the entire building down right now, I know that I am risking the lives of so many Black, brown young people and families who are caught up in this larger cycle. But I can burn individual rooms down that are perpetuating white supremacist realities in order to invite new language, new interpretation, new forms of literacy, new forms of engagement, new ways of pulling on power and privilege within the system that engages conversation. So I tend to try to create a third way camp where we're burning rooms and not necessarily the building right now.
Right, and it's interesting because there are other authors that talk about use that sort of same that same imagery and that similar framework. Sonia Horsford talks about integrating into a burning house, right? And so it is. I mean, it's an extraordinary sort of way of thinking about education in ways that are new maybe for policymakers and academics, intellectuals. How did the book come about?
Yeah, so.
Because I imagine in your work, are you sitting down at your job every day saying, man, this has got to go in the book?
Sort of, right? So the book came about literally from, I think, like a Twitter rant. I think I was, is that right? I think I was on a Twitter rant about something. I don't recall this one. But I was ranting. And in part, the rant was about how do we envision ways for people who lead these institutions to lead them with an abolitionist sensibility. Because my worry was when abolition talk really came into the forefront, namely in 2019-20, with the kind of compounding Black murder that was happening in this United States, that we were not giving leaders both practical but also just philosophical ways of thinking about, like, what do you do? What do you do as a leader when you are still expected to lead institutions of teaching, learning, community, and care, which is how I frame them, in a moment where there are compounding pandemics? And so it initially started as a text that was supposed to be like a response to crisis. And then it kind of shaped into this text of like, well, shit, we're always in a crisis in this country. So instead of responding to being like crisis management and crisis leadership, what does it mean to just lead institutions in abolitionist ways to deal with the crisis that is now, but the one that we know is about to come? And so that's how it really began to take shape. And you're right, part of what really pushed me in this idea of the book was March 12th, 2020. It was my first year anniversary of living here. My first day of work was March 12th, 2019. March 12th, 2020, I told everybody we're going home. And I had to figure out how to lead this thing with a commitment to justice and racial equity and intersectional freedom. And I didn't have a roadmap. And the folks I were talking to were so worried about the most mundane things that I found myself having to pull on instinct, spirit, community, and folks in other works and realms to think about how do we lead this institution to learn.
So tell us about the book. How is it structured? Yeah. What is the major takeaway and theme of the book? We know the title,
sure,
but what's going to hit us when we read those pages?
Yeah, so I mean, the book is structured. It is philosophical to practical, and it ends philosophically. I mean, that's kind of the arch of it. And I'm very sermonic in my writing style. I mean, you can't have a bunch of degrees in theology and not write a sermon. And so, it is very sermonic in its introduction. But the goal of the book is to invite you to situate race as an ongoing crisis in this country. That is essentially chapter one, that race is the ongoing thing that is not a reckoning. It is almost the identity marker of this nation. So if we treat it as the identity marker, we can change the way in which we approach it. Then it takes us to a historical framework, which is, what does abolition mean when we talk about Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth and Nat Turner, and how do we invite their framing into a 2020, 2021, soon to 2022 world? And then it breaks down some very, very, very practically. What does it mean to communicate literally as a leader in abolitionist ways? How do you use language? How do you tease out language? How do you create new words? How do you make decisions? I am always interested in unique stories, and I love the decision chapter in part because I opened with the story of when Captain Sully had to land that plane on the Hudson River after the pigeons went into it. Right. And in part, for me, it informed a kind of abolitionist sensibility of that when you are leading schools through crisis and through compounding crisis, you are always landing the plane on the river every day. And how do you think about what Captain Sully did in guiding that plane? And so it's very practical in that sense, and it offers tools and opportunities for leaders to think about their own practice. And then ultimately, the concluding chapter, which again is philosophical, is called A New Way, A New World, A New Witness. And it offers a glimmer of what the world could be in an abolitionist sense.
And that's an important point to frame this question on, because the world right now is, we are having questions about critical race theory, something that most people are talking about, but those that are railing against it probably never don't understand and will never understand. But these venues now for these political conversations, this political tension and polarization is now moved to, although it's been there for a long time, but we see it now at school board meetings and with school board elections and things like that. How do we, is there a path to implement this framework given this current tension?
Yeah, I think so. I would say I think so, and in part because what the text attempts to do, it attempts to create a world in which everybody can be abolitionists, right? The definition that I offer, I would contend it's quite expansive, and you can see varying entry points without having to do the CRT fight and the CRT debate, right? So it is my view of abolition is one in which all human peoples are free, right? That's including racist, deep rural South white folks, right? It's the idea that everybody must be caught up in the freedom if it's going to be realized. And I contend very Baldwinian that the people who are railing against CRT in part don't realize how much they too need abolition. And need a system that is abolitionist so that they too can be free.
Explain that.
Right?
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So I think so. I believe radical transparency, right? So I think really conservative, aggressive, racist white folks are so blinded by that and by that lived and embodied reality that it can be easy to not realize how you are caught up in oppression in your own self. So I think about a conversation I was having on a flight with a rural farmer, a guy from Iowa. And I don't know how we got engaged in this conversation. And we were talking about the expansion of the SNAP program. And in that conversation, he was going on and on about the rising cost of groceries and how he needed access to more money for these rising costs of groceries. And I said, well, black folks do too, right? And he said, well, yeah, but I work. I said, as to suggest that black folks don't work? Like, where are we going with this, right? And it was so easy for me to realize that on the basis of just racial privilege, he did not realize that a system in which oppressed black people are freed and we shift policy to free the most marginalized, he also wins. That if we expand a program that, yes, disproportionately serves black and brown folks, namely black and brown women, namely single black mothers, he too wins, right? And so that is what I mean by an abolition that works for everybody. And I tend to contend, and I think the book alludes to this, but I don't say this explicitly, is that when we do policy work, when we make decisions, when we lead in ways that are always informed by the most marginalized group within our context, everybody wins in that, right? And so in my work now, I ask, my decision-making abolitionist framework now is, does this work for a single queer black mother? And if it works for her, it will likely work for all the rest of us. Right?
That's just, how difficult is that to communicate? Because we listen to, I'm on TV, other people are on TV, trying to have these conversations, but it doesn't seem, and to your point, it seems like we're just folks are so caught up in their own, whatever their own is. Yeah. They're so caught up in that there is no room for them to stop, acknowledge somebody else's truths. Yeah. And I wonder in the text, for your day-to-day work, and I actually made this point the other day, I happened to be watching a video of Richard Feynman, a physicist, and that's what I do in my free time. I watch videos of physicists. And he was trying to explain this really complex, he was asked a question about a complex issue. He said, the problem with explaining complex concepts in physics is that we have to be able to understand the same things. Point being, we don't have any common truths. And one of the things that struck me about that statement is that not only do we seem to not have a lot of or be able to agree on common truths in this country, but are willingly making decisions to turn away from that because there's safety and comfort in believing other truths or your own truth. And I wonder, again, from a point of view from implementing these kinds of policies, in trying to talk to educators, black and white, how do you go into every school or design systems with this framework? Because that's unpacking so much that's so deeply rooted. It seems almost impossible, but it's got to be done.
Yeah, I agree. So I would never venture to say I have the exact answer, but here's where I tend to start. I start with a word on the cover, which is that communal idea. It is inviting people to transcend a kind of individualism that is unfortunately almost like core to the American project. All right, the American Democratic Project is built on this kind of individual, earn as much as you can earn, do as much as you can do for oneself sensibility, that I always begin with inviting, how far does that get us as a collective if all of us are competing for our individual truths to reign? That conversation is an ongoing one, but it is an important question for me. And in part is because it is formed and informed by a Black emancipatory Black abolitionist sensibility. If Douglass, for example, had really bought into the fullness of that American individualism, then Douglass would have made his way to DC or to Baltimore, then DC, switched his ID, created a name, picked a date of birth, and never thought another thing about the remaining folks who were enslaved. But Douglass was so committed to a kind of communal consciousness, this kind of idea that the we is what uplifts the I, that Douglass's freedom was solely attached to how do all of us go up together. And I tend to play on the selfishness of people to say that you actually can earn more, build more, achieve more, if you do it as a we, right? And so I believe in some degree the subversive nature of abolition is to play on American selfishness and to invite people to say, if you really want to go up and you really want to earn and you really want to have institutions of grandeur, then how do you do it in such a communal way that all of us are participating in that uplift? And that's where I tend to begin, but I also believe, and I'll end here, is invoking memory. That a generation that preceded all of ours right now had a kind of belief in community that seems to be continually dissipating. And so I believe in pulling on memory, even if that memory is a Confederate memory, there was a kind of communal consciousness of what the South needed, wanted. Needed for their own economic gain, but also wanted for power, racial power, right? But even pulling on the idea that there were pockets where folks thought about the we, even in degradatory ways, that the we can be reclaimed as a form of pursuing justice. And then the same way that folks were willing to transcend the I in the name of a larger project, how do we kind of reimagine what that reclamation of the we is, transcending our individual I's for a larger project, which for me is the project of everybody being free. Yeah.
Let me pause here and just say that we have some folks on Zoom as well. And obviously you here in our studio audience. We are happy to take any questions. So I'd have some more questions, but I'll stop here if anybody in our virtual audience or anybody here has any questions that they would like to raise. One of the things that when we started working together, I heard your presentation that was really a strategy for how to get your schools back up and running through this pandemic for this next school year. And I was just fascinated by the amount of detail, by the amount of thought, but also that you didn't have a lot of help from City Hall, for whatever reason. But talk about how you looked at the work that you had to engage in that was ahead of you to get just the students in your school back to school in the fall, and how that sort of jives with the work you've detailed in your book here.
Sure. Yeah. So what a period. Taking my mind back to that week. It was deeply informed, and it still is, by a concept known as womanism, right? Alice Walker, who is a phenomenal author and thinker, developed this idea of womanism, which is rooted in this Black history of little girls acting womanish, acting grown, and participating in larger conversation. And one of the things that I lean on around womanism, and which is what informed that strategy, is womanism, to many degrees, believes with starting with the body and starting with addressing the daily realities, like the kind of mundane or quotidian realities of what it means to be human. And so, do people have food to eat? Can people maintain their rent? Do people have access to prescription? And so for us, the strategy was, if we don't answer questions of the body first and remove that barrier, then asking people to return to a building, asking people to read, asking people to have literacy maintenance, asking people to have high quality instruction won't be able to be sustained because we haven't addressed baseline questions of the body, right? And so that was critical to our initial strategy in opening, is thinking about doing that work first, but secondly, thinking about the ways in which we don't just care for students, but the ways that we care for families and staff who will be expected to do the lift in that moment. That became super core for our project of decision making.
And in doing so, because there was, obviously it required substantial thought, you had to be mindful of the health concerns of the children, of the parents, anybody that walked into that school building. And one of the things that I sort of want to go back to the question about charter schools for a second, is this something that's unique to charter schools? Would you be able to see traditional public schools doing similarly? And it's not to make a play for charter schools specifically, but when you talk about the kind of work that you're doing and the making sure you're taking care of kids wherever they are, is there something that is unique about the charter community that gives you that kind of flexibility?
Yeah, for sure. So, a part of what is on our side in this, in the operational sense, is we have a particular flexibility in decision making that transcends most district and traditional public spaces, where we can move faster, and that our level of urgency can be directly connected to acting and risk taking. Right? And so what I celebrate and love is that there's a particular amount of risk we can take in making decisions that doesn't require going through the massive hoops of bureaucracy of other spaces. And we get the opportunity to both raise and use capital in creative ways that allows us to center the lived needs of people. That was critical for us to respond effectively. I will never forget when we asked ourselves a really hard question very, very early on, which was, how much money will we save with all of our buildings being closed? We got that answer, and then we collectively said, how do we give it all away?
Right. There's a grant program.
Yeah, we created a kind of spin down foundation of, if we're going to save X hundreds of thousands, we need to give it all away. Because we know that folks will be impacted by evictions. We know that folks are losing their jobs at exponential rates. We know that the food disparity and the health disparity realities, particularly of East Harlem and our zip code areas, are profound. On a good day, they're profound. So how do we do our work of having access to capital to cross those realities for people, so that at bare minimum, we're not thinking about three things: where will I live, what will I eat, and will I have access to medicine?
And this is, and again, and you talked about this earlier, when you think about implementation of this abolitionist approach, you need some of that flexibility. And because it seems like the bureaucracy just in and of itself for its own, exists for its own sake, and could be an impediment to this.
Yeah, for sure, right? So one of the historical claims of abolition that I love is when you think about the folks who led abolitionist movements, the rebellion movements in the South, and again the 1800s, there were white abolitionist organizations up north that gave capital, but trusted the folks below that Mason-Dixon line to make decisions in their own freedom interest. All right. And so the capital, in many ways, was capital that was trusting of people in community to do what was best for people in community. And so, in much the same way, you need a certain level of flexibility, but you also need a certain level of folks who are privileged to trust that people who are oppressed know what they need in their oppression.
So that's also peeling back this paternalistic approach to, right.
Oh, absolutely, right. I mean, part of the it's like I think about the strategic planning chapter, and I mean, and strat planning is almost like wink, wink in this text, right? It is really of, do you know enough about the folks within community in order to be able to rely on folks in community to solve issues of community, right? And how do you free yourself from assuming that you have to have a kind of paternalistic heavy hand in giving people what they need, saving people, quote unquote, from themselves, but instead it is a unrestricted trust of people to guide their own truths toward freedom.
Now, and I really just love that point too, because what I think about is the push for community control of schools that had taken place, for decades, where we really saw it implemented here in '68, well, after '68, Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and such. So we had those 32 school districts that we eventually got mayoral control of schools. Is this calling for a return to more community control, away from mayoral control of schools? Can those two things, or are none of those things really important to the eventual outcome of what you're trying to get to here?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I'm sorry we did.
Yeah, no, that's okay. That's a great question. So I think there's a third way in which they can almost coexist, but the reality is that's almost predicated on who the mayor is.
Right.
Right. So there's a version of that where community should, in my estimation, community should always have the ultimate control of institutions that are within community. And because we know that often local governments have a kind of a mayoral heavy hand, how does the mayor or mayoral teams use access to resource, access to power, access to infrastructure that allows communities to have control over community-based schools? To some degree, it invokes the kind of freedom school model, right? That I think about folks like Mary McLeod Bethune. I think about the Children's Defense Fund and Marian Wright Edelman, of who all talked about what does it mean when you put all of the power of educating young people back in the hands of the communities in which they're situated, and governments are only used to facilitate access and resources into those communities so that people can control them, so that people can make decisions. Because I tend to believe that the imagination within community is profound, but unfortunately, it can only be as profound as the access to resource to actualize that imagination. And so often we restrict imagination by restricting resource.
And I think one of the things I tell my students all the time about schools is that they are centers of social, cultural reproduction. Yeah. They are community institutions. So when we talk about rapid closing and reopening of schools, that's disruptive. When you start changing systems very quickly without parental input and community and stakeholder input, it's disruptive. So exactly what you're saying, that that maybe we're asking a question that doesn't need to be asked, mayoral control versus not, is whatever works as long as you're making the community, centering the community and the child.
Yeah, for sure. And I would add to that, they are places of social and cultural reproduction. And I think what this text attempts to also push, right, is they're also places of moral reproduction. Mm-hmm. And they're places of political reproduction. And if we are not careful, what we do is we create institutions where there is a really flat individual morality being reproduced in a community. And so how do we create institutions of learning where the morality that is being shaped, the ethics that are coming out of that space are informed by young people demanding a communal consciousness, young people demanding community control, young people wanting a say in what is best for them in their teaching, their learning, and their care.
Actually, if you could talk about that a little bit, because I don't want anybody to believe or come away from our conversation that this is really about the adults in the system needing to change. That this is also about youth. What's the youth role in this? What is their agency in this?
Yeah, so I think for us, it's profound and central. So I ground a lot of my thinking in a kind of Paulo Freirean sense, right? That all good pedagogy, all good work of schools, all freeing work must be grounded in helping people to investigate the problems that are most proximate to them. And so for us, young people leading and guiding this work is how are we constantly centering for young people that what you are reading, what you are writing, what you are learning must be investigated through the lens of the community in which you're situated, right? So we don't ask you to read a text and not ask you how does it apply to New York City. We don't talk to you about water and then say, let's talk about the water crisis happening in the Bronx. We don't talk to you about air pollutants and say, why are all the waste transfer stations in New York City situated in high concentration in the Black and brown as part of Queens and the Black and brown as part of the South, right? So young people doing this work is about making sure for us that we center their learning, we center their teaching, and we center the conversations that are being had in and born out of their community, what they are experiencing on a daily basis, so that when they go out into the world beyond us, their consciousness has already been shaped by that we. That collective freedom.
So we'll get you out of here with two quick questions left. We have a new mayoral administration coming. What's the biggest piece of advice that you can give the new schools chancellor?
That's a great question. So my biggest piece of advice is grounded in something that we've been talking about, which is in these next 12 to 18 months, that person is going to have to build the trust through ongoing dialogue with all communities, namely the most marginalized, the most suppressed communities in this city. Connected to that, that person is going to have to wrestle with how do we ensure equitable access to funds for communities that have been traditionally and historically held in deep poverty in this city. To me, those are the two starting points if we're going to really have a conversation.
And lastly, tell us what we need to walk away from here with that energizes us, gives us power from the text, from your own work. How should we walk away from here feeling and believing about abolitionist leadership in schools?
Yeah, so it's grounded in James Baldwin.
Yeah.
It's going to always come back to Baldwin for me. And one of the rhythms of abolition for me is this kind of hope that must be invented daily. And I believe that the power and beauty of the work that I get to do and all of us get to do is that regardless of our seat, our title, our position, our institution, we get the privilege in the name of justice of inventing hope every day, of going into our roles and going into our work and asking ourselves, what can I be hopeful about that lends itself toward the building of freedom? What can I discover hope within that invites people to see justice in the work that I do? And so if nothing else, I invite all of us to leave here with a renewed sense that if all of us can participate in the abolitionist project, then all of us can discover and then rediscover every single day a kind of hope that fuels our work.
Abolitionist leadership in schools, undoing systemic injustice through communally conscious education. Dr. Robert Harvey, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Again, we welcome the folks that are watching on Zoom, and we thank you for joining us. We will have this available in kind of package so that we can send out electronically, so you can see it on video, you could see it on audio if you don't like to see our face at all, and look forward to your support for more events here at Roosevelt House. So thank you all very much.